Hi everyone, my name is Kristen and I'm going to be presenting alongside Vanessa Reyes. And the title of our presentation is Exploring Data Friction, Recommendations for Cultural Heritage and Digital Humanities. And our project is stemming from about 2 years worth of collaborative research. And we're very excited to be discussing the concepts that we use to guide our project, as well as the findings that we hope are reflective of our recommendations for interdisciplinary and even transdisciplinary work and research for research data management. So, like I said, my name is Kristen. I lecture in digital curation at King's College London in the Department of Digital Humanities. And my email is kristen.schuster@kcl.ac.uk. And please feel free to reach out if you have any questions about our presentation. Vanessa?
Thank you, Kristen. And my name is Vanessa Reyes. I'm an instructor at the University of South Florida School of Information. My email is vanessa.reyes@usf.edu. And just as Dr. Kristen Schuster said, contact me if you have any questions or anything that we discussed today. So yeah, thank you so much. Let's move right along.
Excellent. So we thought it would be a good idea to give an overview for our presentation structure. So since we'll be taking turns presenting, we thought it would be a good idea to gently remind you which of us is speaking. So we've included photos of ourselves on the slides that we're discussing. You can also see that Zoom is very good at keeping track of who is talking. And as we mentioned, please feel free to reach out via email if you have any questions, but also feel free to reach out if you would like to request a copy of our slides. And we've included questions that we think are worth reflecting on and carrying on discussions about at the end of each of our sections. And of course, during our panel, you are more than welcome to pose your own questions. And we'll be wrapping up by providing a quick overview and discussion of how we plan on applying the findings that we will be discussing for the rest of our presentation. So to get started, we want to provide some context, namely the kinds of theoretical underpinning and kind of conceptual framework that we've used to think about why it's sometimes challenging for cultural heritage institutions and digital humanities scholars and practitioners to pool data and to collaborate and really make the most out of the resources and perspectives that each has to share. So we use the concept data friction based on this definition presented by Edwards et al. In 2011. And so Edwards and their co-author were thinking about the social sciences specifically while thinking about data friction. But Vanessa and I feel that data friction is a concept that can be generalized to other disciplines where you have multiple research perspectives, multiple disciplinary kinds of perspectives, because the humanities is a really broad umbrella term, right? And then you add digital in front of it and it grows exponentially, right? The same can be said for cultural heritage, right? Cultural heritage isn't kind of isolated in one particular type of institution or collection, right? And so this means that researchers and practitioners from the digital humanities and cultural heritage will not only approach research from different perspectives with different goals in mind, but they'll also be producing different data formats, right? So there will be different technical needs as well as different procedural kinds of needs and experiences and processes that might pose barriers for communication. But what Vanessa and I are interested in exploring is how to mitigate these barriers, right? And how to view them, these points of difference, as opportunities for conversations, right? To recognize different practices, different data formats, different goals and end games as points for bringing in different areas of expertise, right? So we can think about interoperability, right, as Edwards et al. Would say, but we can think about that while also recognizing the potential for meaning to be garbled if we're not careful about the approaches we take and the standards that we apply, right? And so one of the things that has really kind of guided Vanessa and my collaboration is the fact that we're both information scientists, right? We're both library and information scientists by training and kind of by affinity and pure kind of passion at this point in our careers. So we have our own perspective on why managing information is an important step in the kind of interdisciplinary collaboration process, right? And so by thinking about this need for collaboration to overcome any kinds of points of friction, we think that digital humanities scholars and practitioners can really appreciate the challenges for information management and even information and data creation within the sources that they're, studying. But then also, kind of on the flip side of that, cultural heritage institutions can think about themselves as repositories for information that researchers want to find, and to use that kind of insight and thought to reflect on their own practices, right? And so one of the things we think is really important in this whole process is to acknowledge the roles that standards play in informing the decisions both researchers and practitioners from the digital humanities and cultural heritage arenas take, but that they're not the only thing we can talk about, right? And so we should think about data management as a messy process where there isn't just a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. And so with that in mind, we are very aware of the fact that data friction is one particular kind of framework for thinking about why research data management is difficult, but we don't necessarily know fully whether it is the most appropriate term or concept to use. So we think that that's a point to kind of discuss and reflect on, right? And then what's more, based on how appropriate you feel it is, we can start thinking about how we might use it to facilitate discussions between researchers and practitioners, right? Because there are different goals between thinking about research data management as a fantastic concept that we should all engage in, and then actually having to go do it, right? So we can think about this, in the context of cultural heritage institutions, right? And as, libraries, archives, museums, and galleries particularly, but we can also think about this from the perspective of the digital humanities, right? And the different kinds of standards that will have to be brought up and explained, but then also pushed back against and considered as collaborations proceed and kind of gain momentum. So we can kind of take this conceptual underpinning and start thinking about what Vanessa and I actually did. And she will chime in eventually, I promise. But we can think about, the kind of research practices that we undertook, right? So we started in 2018 as we were writing a book chapter about data management for the digital humanities. And we reached out through professional listservs, such as IFLA, CILIP, the Digital Preservation Coalition, and then ARLIS UK and Ireland. And we received feedback from colleagues in the Netherlands, Australia, the United States, Spain, and the United Kingdom. So we had a nice kind of international sample. It was small, but it was still, representing a range of different kinds of contexts and practices, namely also legal kinds of remits and frameworks. And then 6 of our respondents volunteered to carry on a discussion via email about, their data management kinds of practices within their own kind of discipline or community of practice. And then also strategies that they would use to communicate with colleagues about data and data management practices. And then to also kind of fold in, the discussion that was sparked by question 2, we were interested in knowing what kinds of data, types, formats, file sizes, etc., that were most common kind of within an institutional setting. And then we were also interested in the kinds of infrastructures and frameworks and technological support that research data managers would have for their kinds of day-to-day practices. And so based on these findings, Vanessa and I did a follow-up survey and a follow-up set of email correspondence this past summer, so 2020. And we asked the same set of survey questions. And again, we had a relatively small sample, but we did have respondents from a nice geographical distribution in the United Kingdom, Europe, Southeast Asia, and North America. And this time, the majority of our respondents were working in higher education or the public sector. And we had two email conversations with colleagues, both of whom are based in the Netherlands. And so we did ask slightly different questions via email. We were mostly interested in clarification about job titles and descriptions, so the remit that an individual responsible for data management would undertake. And because we noticed a slight shift in the kind of type of professional who was responding, we were interested in descriptions about institutional affiliations, as well as types of training received for the work that was being undertaken in their current post. And then also discussing kind of time in post and work experience. So with that in mind, we've started becoming very curious about whether or not research data management practices actually help mitigate against data friction, right? I know kind of alluded to this before, but we think that kind of refreshing and placing this question kind of at the forefront is a good way to kind of move forward and understand Vanessa's discussion of our findings. So with that in mind, over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you so much. That was just lovely. So now we're going to discuss our findings. And I'm going to go back to the initial 2018 findings. Whoop. Let's go back one. So we realized that as Kristen mentioned, in the digital humanities, depending on the institutions that you're discussing and the size of the institution and infrastructure, there really isn't a one-size-fits-all method. There are different practices and standards that really identify with those specific institutions, and there's going to be different needs and policies associated with that. But because it's so unique, we found that there were some similarities, there were some differences, but the most important thing is that there is a collaboration between researchers and practitioners, and there's a need for that. It's important. We need to have more of that sustained relationship between the practitioner and the researcher as early as the beginning. And so we found that that was one of the most concerning things, that most of the professionals that we interviewed really expressed those feelings of needing to have that connection, to have these efforts there when it comes to working with colleagues, researchers, clients, etc., depending on the institutions and how they serve users and such. And then we also saw these challenges that have to do with influencing data outcomes. And that's a difficulty, because if you're working specifically with researchers, you want to make sure that you have no biases there. But at the same time, you want to have a point of reference throughout the process so that researchers know what they need to do from the beginning. And because data does change. It changes over time. As you're creating it, it changes. After you've created it, what are you going to do with it? How is it that you're processing it? How is it that we're finding these tools that we need to protect this type of research data? These are the questions and challenges that these researchers experience, but these digital humanities professionals have to attend to. And because it's commonplace to have different outcomes, different data types, they're running into these constant issues with preserving it and managing it. So that was really one of the biggest issues. So they have to really look at their data management processes and look at what the plan is and really address where in the data management plan things need to be restructured. So that was one of the things we noticed from this study that was really, really sticking out to us the most when we looked at the data. And when we revisited the study earlier this year in the summertime, we saw that there were definitely a little bit more specifics involved in this sample, where now when it comes to the research data management process, we're seeing more of a streamlined system. We're getting down to these data functions and we're thinking critically now in terms of meaning us being the data humanity professionals. Are we going to be archiving this research data for the long term? We really need to start thinking about this. We need to think about curating and preserving research data because it's important, because we need it, and because formats will change. There will be bit distortion. There will be so many different things, but we need to have an awareness. And this group that we worked with really gave us this sense of awareness that we have different types of data, and we don't know what we're going to do with it. And we need to find ways, we need to find sustainable ways that don't cost. Because a lot of these digital humanities institutions really suffer a lot too with cost and cost efficiency and finding ways in which to advocate for their services. And their services are essential. They're important. They need to be there from the beginning of the data management research process. So the researcher is working with the data, creating the data. That is the beginning of their encounter with data, as we say. And that is when we need to step in as research data managers. We need to advocate for having that touch, that communication with the researcher from the beginning. And also, we need to also think about one of the suggestions that we saw that really stuck out to us from these findings was that we need to make sure that we're providing better access to this data. Specific cultural heritage institutions that really have thrived through providing open source materials. This is so important, especially in the times we're in right now. I mean, having open access to information, prohibits that barrier. But how are we going to do that? How are we going to provide this kind of, dissemination of information if we really need to make sure that we're understanding the process of coordinating the digital infrastructure, streamlining the systems, as we mentioned, and making sure that we are creating a plan, a sustainable plan for the long term for archiving data. So we can't really get to that final outcome without really getting a sense of awareness of these different types of data that these different institutions are working with, they're dealing with. So that's really the sense of urgency here of these findings, and with that comes challenges. So we did notice that the challenges from this round of data that we analyzed was that really data accessibility. We want to make sure, as I mentioned before, that we have access to data, but how do we do that? So how are we going to build an awareness. We build an awareness that, we need to preserve data. We need to make sure it's accessible. And here's the problem. A lot of the time, researchers really don't realize that their data is important, because it is. It's important. There's a lot of emphasis in how important the data is, and there's so many points throughout the whole process of data collection and whatnot that they don't consider data as an asset. It's only a requirement through grant funding that you have such preservation plan, but you really need to think about how important this data is to others and other institutions that are working to create these types of changes within X, Y, and Z study that you're working on. So this is a big challenge, really, to incorporate the importance, to plan for a sustainable, plan to preserve this data, and really incorporate research data management standards into the research workload. Because in truth, Dr. Schuster and I, we have quite the research workload. And when you kind of think about even putting ourselves into that concept, we have to really think about what is the appropriate infrastructure that we need for our own types of data that we're creating, and how are we going to manage this data as we go? How are we going to protect it? How are we going to disseminate it? Who is going to be in charge and taking care of it for the long term? So these are the questions that researchers have been challenged with. But then the institution has to deal with those questions along with their collection policy and sticking to those policies while also working firsthand with the infrastructure that they already have in place. So there's much need for evaluation when it comes to the guidance and support of data handling from both ends, from the institutional standpoint and from the users and the researchers' standpoint. So these are some challenges that we think are very important and need to be addressed right now in our current time. And without trying to make a generalization, I think it really is showing us that it's important to really value these types of data and create a plan for the long term. So that's going to lead to more of us going into future studies that deal with these changes. And also, this also leads to some really great questions about all these findings. And really, how are we going to understand cultural heritage institutions when they can potentially narrow future conversations that have to deal with all this? So how are we going to narrow down these conversations so that we can start to make these changes? Because out of this study, we really want to make sure that we create an awareness. That's quite the truth. We want to create an awareness, but how do we do this in such a broad field where we're really overlooking these key disciplinary areas? And how do we include this in the research process? How do we include research data management in the research process? I think that is really the question here as well. So those are some concerns, and I think that as you go through our presentation from the beginning to now, start thinking about how we can start to make these changes and what directions we can take as well. We're welcome to suggestions. So now we're looking at some more recommendations and strategies specifically, and some more resources. I'm going to open this up some more so that Dr. Schuster can give us a little bit more about some guidelines for practitioners. Schuster?
Yes, so thank you. Thank you so much, Vanessa. So we've broken down our recommendations, and we'd like to start by thinking about practitioners, right? And one of the areas that we think is challenging but really fruitful is to adapt terminology and to kind of clarify meaning, right, as you're writing budgets, right, as you're setting benchmarks for evaluating project progress, right, so that throughout a whole kind of research life cycle and throughout the whole kind of workflow that you're setting up or even kind of placed into, you're able to use terminology that you're comfortable with while still accommodating researcher needs and practices, right? So that there's this ability to facilitate this kind of back and forth and exchange about, you know, technical terminology and infrastructure requirements. Now, I would like to point out that this is easier said than done, but keeping that kind of in the forefront of any kind of conversation can be a good way to start building bridges instead of, you know, 6 months into a project realizing that one person's understanding of data doesn't match with another person's understanding of data, right? And that by adapting and improving the ways that we use technical terminology to think about research data management practices, we're creating the potential to build frameworks for more inclusive and nuanced conversations about IT infrastructures. because one barrier that we've noticed to research data management is the technical components, knowing about file formats, knowing about storage spaces, knowing about sign-on protocols and permissions, right? And then, also knowing about actual kinds of nuances and legal policies and statutes and good practice recommendations, right? And so using terminology to open up spaces for asking questions can create more inclusive conversations about technical demands and needs, right? So then again, you're distributing the potential to share information and to truly collaborate, right? And the end goal with all of this is that by sharing information management strategies, we're able to actually share the information, right, itself, right? And to think about collaboration as a fruitful process of recognizing the strengths and weaknesses of colleagues, of collaborators, right? And then also even of institutions, right? Because some institutions have different budgets, some institutions have different long-term goals, but that's not to say that that doesn't negate the potential for new voices to emerge and new resources to come to the forefront to facilitate kind of broader conversations. So, Vanessa?
So in that same train of thought, it's important to really pay attention to your client's needs. And as an information professional, as a data manager, you come up with questions asking them, a brief overview. What is it that you want to accomplish with your data? How is it that you want to manage it? You want to create a strategy that supports the data that's being created, but also suits the purpose that the data is going to fit and intended to be used and by whom. These are the questions that you ask from the beginning so that you know exactly how to cater these plans to the type of data that you're going to be handling and working with. And you also want to focus on a hands-on strategy, as we say. This really is important because working closely with clients is really the key to gaining a better understanding of not just the client's needs, but also the types of data that they're handling, as well as the focus of the project, which is so important because when we gain a better understanding of the purpose of that so what factor, you really get a sense of what the client's needs are, and then you have that. You can later on say, okay, I'm going to cater to these needs and be able to assure that, we're covering, ethics and privacy and we're able to provide a plan for you that works and that protects your rights, as well as provides you with that purposeful plan for managing your data in the long term. So that's really important. And then that leaves us with some discussion questions. Do you want to go over those questions, Kristen?
Sure. So Vanessa and I both very keen to think about functional ways to facilitate interdisciplinary collaborations. And since, I work in the digital humanities now, and Vanessa works in the information sciences, right, we're very keen to think about how the humanities are a fruitful interdisciplinary space and the ways digital tools can really broaden these kinds of collaborations. And to think about the ways that research data management strategies can really build bridges between researchers and practitioners, right? And to think about the sources of data, right? The keepers or even, the managers and creators of content that is studied, like museums, galleries, archives, and libraries, that there are opportunities to think about the needs and practices within those institutions, not just as something to study, but as points for collaboration and informing the technologies and the strategies we use to not only create data, but to manage that data. Right. And then last but not least, because we have borrowed this concept of data friction, right, if we think way back to the start of this presentation, from Rajaskar Edwards, got that one wrong, apologies, Edwards et al.'s article, right, and they were looking at the social sciences specifically I think that this alludes to the potential for the social sciences and the humanities to come into closer kinds of conversations and proximity about good research practices within the academy, and then also to think about good practices for collaborating with institutions with very practical pressing needs for managing data, right? And so to not only say we should consider researcher practitioner kinds of collaborations, but interdisciplinary collaborations kind of in the broadest, most literal sense possible. So with that in mind, we would like to wrap up with a short kind of discussion about the ways we would like to move forward and continue thinking about data friction, but possibly in a slightly more prescient way, since we're all working from home now, and that adds new challenges to research data management. So Vanessa, would you like to start off?
Yes. So as we know, we're dealing with a global pandemic right now, COVID-19, and many scholars, many information professionals, social scientists, are now forced to work from home. And so we're dealing with our personal information spaces and how truly those personal information spaces have changed. And just to quickly define, a personal information space really serves as a space for users in which they use their personal digital information that involves their private persona as well as their professional personas, which often are interchangeable in any given time, especially now with the way that we are working from home, most of everyone, if not essential personnel that are not working from home. Many places have been evolving and now returning to work environments, but there are still lots of researchers, social scientists that are still at home, and they are working on almost like I would say, a good in-between compromise of how am I going to really commit to this personal information space that I call my professional space, but I also have, it is also my personal information space. So we're interested in really looking at participants with a survey, how they generally feel about these information management changes prior to COVID-19. We want to figure out how it was and what happened now that they are at home after these safer at home protocols. What are these changes? What have been these effects when it comes to accessing their personal data? And have there been access issues, interruptions? I'm sure there's a lot to say there, and we need to document that. And we're also going to be asking some follow-up questions and providing some visual examples of how these personal information spaces have changed, because we want to be able to see how is it that they access personal digital information before, and how that has changed now. Do they have access to everything? Do they have the same liberties as before? I mean, there's so many things, so many issues with information access because of these times. So we are going to be addressing all that as we work with the participants, and really looking at these impacts, because they're so important to document, and we need to figure out a way to manage this data or this situation in a better way. So really, we want to get in touch with participants and have them say what they're experiencing. So that's the first stage, and Kristen's going to go over a little bit more about our focus and scope with a more integration of personal information management and research data management through a gendered lens.
So one of my main areas of work is thinking through strategies for integrating gender studies and feminist theories into information science work. And so while Vanessa was talking through her interest in thinking about, research data management and personal information management, during times of kind of upheaval and chaos, I, of course, came along and said, what about gender, Vanessa? And she was like, yeah, what about gender, Kristen? And so we started having a very fruitful conversation about the ways working from home have put new pressures on family units, and we are seeking to define families in as broad and inclusive a way as possible, but how this new dynamic has really challenged feminist and gender studies scholarship on the concept of emotional labor and unwaged labor, and to see how we can use those theories to discuss, right, why research data management in the best of times is difficult, but then in times of upheaval and stress becomes additionally difficult, and new rhetorics and discursive practices will emerge to negotiate, justify, and complain about outcomes and pressures that are being applied. Right, and so we will continue looking into digital humanities and cultural heritage areas. So because as I tell my students, you can't study everyone. You need a population, right, to sample from, and to think about the ways personal information management and research data management intersect. Again, using these concepts of unwaged and emotional labor, because A, they seem the most obvious, and B, there's a lot of fruitful discussion and emerging work around what it means for labor to be unwaged. And while we're using feminist studies and theories, we understand that gender is a very kind of complex and interesting, multifaceted concept to engage with. So we're also keen to start, again, breaking down barriers that cause assumptions and points of friction, so that the goal being to look at inclusive and sustainable practices, as we've been discussing since the outset of our presentation. And with that in mind, that is the last bit of our presentation. Please feel free to reach out, and thank you very much for your time. We look forward to hearing from you.